Okay, this has been with the City of Yucaipa. I'm the City Plan Manager. We're presenting live on YouTube of the American Viticultural Area Planning Committee meeting for today, April 21st. We'll kind of get started. I'll help coordinate the lead since we're doing this via teleconference, and it's a little of a unique approach to have a public meeting, but we'll make it work. Certainly appreciate all of our AVA Planning Committee members for attending. And we'll start with call to order. So I will be doing a roll call. All the committee members, for the record, please just say aye when I get to your name that you are present, and then that way we can mark it down for that. And then we'll kind of go into the next steps for the meeting. So we'll start with the first person on the committee that did identify that they would not be present. Is Jillian Koluk, Ben Mastafari, here, Mike Hoyman, Craig Heaps,
here,
Craig Suveg,
present,
Christine Moeller,
here,
J.R. Algauer, Bobby Duncan. Says his phone number's here. Denise Allen.
She's trying to get on right now.
Oh, she is. Okay. And then Tony Matlock.
here,
And then Denise Work.
here.
Okay, we will start next with a flag salute that Christine Mueller will lead us in. We do have a lovely flag kind of showing in the corner of our room that has been added in for the presentation. We'll let Christine lead us when she's ready.
Okay, ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States,
States of America,
and to the republic
to the republic
Which
for which
is
it
stands
one nation,
stands, one nation,
under God,
under God,
indivisible,
indivisible, with liberty
with liberty and justice
for all.
for all.
Right on, everybody.
Okay.
It's a good thing we're not doing a 9-part harmony today with the delay on the phones, but that was actually pretty good.
Did everyone get a chance to look at the minutes?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay. Do you have a motion to approve those?
I'll make a
I move
motion.
that we approve the meetings. This is Craig Heaps. Approve the minutes.
I'll second.
And Christine, do you want a second?
Yep, sure.
All in favor?
Aye.
Let's go.
Aye.
Just say one at a time. Everybody I'll say aye. This is Denise Work.
We'll do,
You want to do this roll call?
yeah, that'll be the easiest. I'll do it with the members that are here. Ben
All
Massa.
right.
Craig Heaps.
Aye.
Craig Suveg.
Aye.
Christine Mueller.
Aye.
Tony Matlock.
Aye.
And then Denise Work.
Aye.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have anybody on for public comment?
We did receive, as part of our notice, a public comment letter that was received, and so I will read it into the record for everyone's consideration. So this email is received by Bill Tilbury, and it says, at this point in time, I would like to see the committee refocus on helping businesses in the area get through the COVID virus. Normal meeting later. Hopefully we can brainstorm to help businesses survive during this time and maintain health directives. Part of this purpose of this committee is to help business in the community through the AVA plan. Now we need to broaden the scope. And I can jump in just kind of real quick. The AVA committee really is focused on the planning area implementation. City staff, however, is working to provide resources to businesses as part of those efforts. And then other committees such as the Uptown and then the EDAT committee is probably better focused on specifically on the business discussion and those recovery efforts than where this is more focused on kind of the planning visioning process. But But certainly the comment is well received, and the city is committed to helping all of our local businesses through this very unique and difficult time.
Okay. All right. That's a good answer to that. Does anyone have a comment? Okay.
I agree with it.
Yeah, we all, I think, can agree with you, Ben.
Okay.
So do you have your presentation?
Yep. So kind of as a general note, given that this is our first foray into the teleconference meeting with this committee, as well as the larger number of committee members that are a part of this group, this first meeting really is, we had modified the agenda a little bit to be more of a presentation, giving background information as follow-up to some of our prior meetings, but with the goal of not having a lot of dialogue at this point as we get our feet wet into this process. Certainly recognizing that it's a very unique way to have a public meeting with a teleconference with this committee and the collaborative approach. The lessons learned from this meeting, and certainly as the health directives change in the future, hopefully we'll be able to resume a bit more of a open collaborative environment setting for these meetings, so that as we start refining the goals and objectives process that we're all very interested in meeting, we can start kind of tailoring the project and have that environment. But because of kind of the unique approach, this is really going to be kind of led by Placeworks and giving just information of the context that we're living in for housing requirements, and giving a little bit more just fact-based information on that. And then as we progress onto future meetings and refine this approach, we'll kind of resume more of the collaborative dialogue that we as city staff, as well as all the committee members, want to do as part of this vision exercise. So just wanted to at least put that out there so that everyone kind of knows why the meeting is kind of structured this way. And certainly as we get feedback, we'll adjust the meeting format for subsequent meetings as well. And so with that, we do have Mark Hoffman, who is helping the city actually with our housing element update, and then Sheila with Placeworks, who's helping with this project, participating. So Mark will be leading the presentation for that, and then we'll be letting me know when to advance the slides as well. We'll keep a note for everyone as we go transition to the slides to give a slight pause for a second, so that those are viewing on YouTube and talking on the phone, Denise work as an example, we can at least make sure that we're accommodating that transition effectively, and that way everyone's able to participate well. And then we will be able to provide the PowerPoint presentation after the meeting as well, similar to the last one that we had as well.
Denise on. So just so you know, Denise Allen has joined us.
Okay.
And Denise, if you're trying to speak, just know that your microphone is muted. You'll have to unmute that to make a comment.
Got it.
All right, and Mark, you have the floor.
All righty. Well, thanks a lot, Ben. I appreciate it. Can you hear me?
That we can.
Okay, terrific. All right. So what I would like to do today is going to our second slide, is just talk a little bit about an overview of the general plan and its relationship to viticulture, economic development, and housing. Secondly, then go into a more focused discussion about housing laws that affect the housing element and also affect viticulture as well due to their relationship. And then really after that, just move into some next steps in the process. So with that briefly, before I begin, I also just want to mention housing element law is one of the most trickiest and voluminous set of laws in California. There's more that's been written on the housing element, more that's been litigated on the housing element than any other general plan element. And so if you haven't, I always like to say, legal matters are not suited well for PowerPoint. So if you have any questions or any ambiguities, feel free to ask. Let's not assume. Just ask me whatever questions that you have, and I'll do the best I can to answer them, or we'll get back to you about the answers. So with that, if we can just go to the third slide, Ben. Just a quick overview of the general plan. And by the way, it's wonderful to be back after 4 or 5 years. So working on the general plan and the housing element. But in terms of production, I mean, we all know that agriculture and rural Yucaipa, I mean, it's a fundamental part and heritage of Yucaipa. I mean, we reflected that in the general plan, and we made a number of different provisions recognizing different neighborhoods and portions of the city as having an agricultural heritage, and to the extent that that can be preserved and built upon for the future. I mean, at the same time, what we also recognize, and this came on later on the general plan process, just before, around about 2016, was that the city has been and continues to benefit from some boutique destination tourism, and whether that's locally through the downtown, or some of the tourism that's occurring up in Oak Glen, or even as far up to the mountain and Forest Falls and whatnot, boutique destination tourism has been taking a hold in Yucaipa and does offer a wonderful opportunity for economic development. Thirdly, what we also understand, and this occurred at the latter part of the general plan adoption process, that wineries and vineyards can be an important economic development tool and an important part of having a boutique destination tourism spot in San Bernardino County. And so we do recognize the benefits locally and regionally of viticulture. And I think finally the issue that really faces us today is how do we take into account Yucaipa's historic roots and in a fashion that is sensitive to today's needs and the desire for economic development and the need to continue to provide housing for the city's residents and workforce. So with that, slide number 4, excuse me. This is just an overview of the existing general plan map. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but if you remember, we had a lot of preservation areas, the green areas around the city were the emerald collar. The north bench is the light green areas. You can obviously see the central portion of the city where there's some higher density. And then, of course, Dunlop Acres to the west and Wildwood Canyon to the south and the east. And then the Freeway Corridor Specific Plan. Next slide. And just briefly, we know that vacant land will be needed for the AVA and that most of the Yucaipa's vacant lands are currently zoned as residential. The primary amount of vacant land is in the North Bench and in the Freeway Corridor areas, with some spotted, with also some significant vacant acreage in Dunlop Acres and Wildwood Canyon, but predominantly in North Bench and Freeway Corridor areas, particularly the larger lots. We also know that existing vacant land has some significant infrastructure challenges that are being overcome over time, which is water and sewer, and the infrastructure necessary to deliver that. At the same time, we also know that residential land in the city is heavily regulated by the state of California and continues to be increasingly regulated by the state of California. And so what we're trying to do essentially with the housing element is how do we meet housing in a way that works with the city's heritage and where it's going in the future. If we can just jump to slide number 7, and I wanted to just provide a general overview of the housing element requirements. And as I mentioned before, there is so much. It's easy to make assumptions or misstate or not get all the qualifications in state law. So if there are questions, feel free to note them and I'll answer them to the best I can. So as you probably know, California state law requires that all cities in the state of California have a general plan. And the general plan is designed to do really 3 basic things, is addressing growth in the future over the life of the general plan, or I should say over the life of the community, looking at ways to preserve what's best, and also incentivize change that's needed to achieve the city's overall vision. It specifically requires, among other 7 mandated elements, a housing element chapter that's specifically designed to plan for future growth that's consistent with the city's vision, it's consistent with state law, and with the direction that, and all other housing laws that exist. Probably the most fundamental thing about the housing element, and something that I think all of us here, we hear about in the news is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And what the Regional Housing Needs Assessment is designed to do is to ensure that every community in the state of California has a role in facilitating and encouraging the production of housing. As you know, we have a statewide shortage of housing of all income levels. And so what the Regional Housing Needs Assessment does is the state and the regional government entity, which is SCAG, work together to produce mandated housing goals for every city in Southern California. And the city's goal for the 2021 to 2029 period is planning for 2,859 units. That is the goal, the minimum goal for which cities have to respond to. And that goal is divided into 4 affordability categories. So we have, and there's some specific formulas for figuring out the different categories, but essentially 700 very low income units, about 500 low income units, about 500 moderate income units, with the majority, 1,153, being above moderate income units. And when you think of something like that, what we're looking at is very low and low, or typically apartments of rentals of some sort. The moderate income tends to be lower cost single family or condominiums. Above moderate tends to be single family residential. Mobile homes are also in the very low and low category. Those are generalities. They will vary depending upon the location, amenities that are in the housing. The RHNA, it is updated every year, every 8 years, with additional housing planning goals. So for instance, if we're planning for 2,859 units and those are built, SCAG will come around 8 years from now in 2029 and give the city another housing allocation for the next 8 years. And that continues onward indefinitely. So we're not just trying to plan for today, we're also trying to plan for what we might see in the future. And the way that we satisfy this mandate is that state law doesn't require that we build the units, but state law does require that we plan for them. And planning for them really comes in 3 ways. Is one, we want to make sure that there's enough land available in the city to accommodate housing. And then secondly, to be able to zone that land at appropriate density levels. And then thirdly, we do have to show that the development standards and other types of regulations facilitate this type of growth. Now, even though I say that it is a planning goal, there is accountability on the other side. The city will submit a progress report every year to the state that indicates how many units are being built. And if not enough units are being built, there are other mechanisms and issues that come into play, whether it's the Permit Streamlining Act or other types of requirements that hold cities accountable for housing units being built at the right affordability levels. Lot to take in. I think for some of you this will be old hat. For others, it'll be new. But hopefully that gives you a good sense. Moving on to slide number 8. So the next 3 slides, what I wanted to do is talk about some new state laws that have been passed in the last couple years that are really in some ways constraining the cities and limiting the city's ability to meet their regional housing needs numbers. And they are real constraints, and we'll have to deal with them. And frankly, there are probably more than a dozen new bills coming down. Some of them are well thought out. Some of them are just fictional that really are going to drive the narrative around housing. So I did want to focus on at least 3 or 4 and give you a sense of some of the things that I think will be major challenges for the housing element for this time around. And the first law is what we call no net loss. It's SB 166, but it's no net loss. And what this law essentially says is that every city must make sure that they have enough land in the city with the right zoning and development standards that can address that unmet RHNA. So for example, your 700 units of very low income or your 500 units of moderate income, there always has to be enough sites to meet that deficit at all times. And this definitely has some implications for land use planning. So for example, if a city decides to take an action that could affect them achieving the RHNA, And here are just a few of the examples. Maybe it's approving a moratorium or growth control. Maybe it's down zoning a parcel or redesignating a parcel from residential to some other use, or approving it below its allowable density. The city actually has to come back and submit findings when that action is taken, that the action that the city has, whether it's down zoning, approving a development at a lower density, they have to make a finding that that does not preclude the city from achieving the RHNA. So say, for example, you have limited multiple family development sites, apartment sites, and someone comes in and wants to build it, but builds a high-end condominium. You actually have to come back, say, yep, we're going to approve the project, but we're going to make a finding that we still have enough sites to deal with the very low and low-income housing. And that can be burdensome at times. Another option that a city can do is say, well, if we don't have that, then we have to rezone or upzone another parcel to make up the lost capacity. And we have 180 days to do so. And thirdly, if there are significant changes to the housing element, we have to resubmit it back to an agency, state agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, for their review and approval. This whole process did not exist several years ago, and I think will be. I think it will really drive housing policy, and frankly, it'll make it challenging for even city staff to track the parcels and make sure all the findings are made. So why don't we move to slide number 9? The second of third is called the Housing Crisis Act of 2019, which is SB 330. And what the genesis of this was simply the legislature knew that there was a crisis going on with housing, and what they did is they went well beyond the net loss, the no net loss provision, and said, until 2025, this state law actually preempts a lot of local action. But basically what it says is that it prohibits the city from reducing its housing capacity to less than it was in effect in January 1, 2018. So basically whatever you had in place about a year or two ago, which is shortly after the adoption of the general plan, stays the same unless you can make up the housing someplace else. So for example, it's no longer permissible. I mean, there are some exceptions, but it's no longer permissible for a moratorium, limits on land use approvals or permits, caps on housing units, limiting the population. These types of tools that cities often use to prevent themselves from growing for a variety of reasons are very difficult to do unless they're done under very strict guidelines. So for example, a water and sewer permit shortage would be an issue, but it has to be very well documented with priority permits issued for lower income housing. But nonetheless, they really tied cities' hands. And furthermore, number 3 is that if a project does come in and it happens to demolish low-income units, those units need to be replaced as well as new units coming online. And this bill here is going to be in place for about another 5 years. We don't know what's going to happen after that, but it is just an emergency. That's why they call it the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. So I think moving to the next slide, slide number 10, and I think this is the last one I want to cover, and there are others. It's called AB 1397, and there's a number of bills that have made it more difficult for a city to show that they comply with those regional housing needs mandates, because there's 3 ways that you can comply with the mandates. Actually, 2 primary ways. One is to provide sites that allow for housing. The second is to actually have sticks and bricks put on the ground that correspond with those affordability levels. This affects how we count sites because, frankly, the numbers that we're being given are really high. It's going to be very, very difficult to have the construction occur, but we can make the sites available. Number 1 constraint is that this requires parcels to have sufficient water, sewer, dry utilities, and other types of infrastructure available and accessible to support housing. Or if it's not available, it needs to be in a general plan program to provide such services. And so I'll kind of give you an example. Our prior housing element that was approved and is in compliance with state law listed a number of apartment sites in the freeway corridor specific plan that would be used to meet the RHNA. They do have definite constraints, potential constraints, actual constraints with water, sewer, and utilities. A key question for our housing element will be, can we still meet this test for those particular sites? If we cannot meet the test and the state agency does not accept it, we'll have to go out and find an additional 800 to 1,200 additional units on top of what we already have to meet the regional housing needs mandate. So that will be a significant challenge. Secondly, is vacant and underutilized sites. Oftentimes, because development happens slower as it comes out into the Inland Empire, it's usually hotter near the coast. It happens a little slower as you go further inland. You may have vacant sites or underutilized sites that sit on the ground for a number of years, but they're in the housing element, and they're just waiting for the market to be ripe. Now, the way state law is written is that if those sites have been sitting in prior housing elements and they haven't been developed, the assumption under state law is that those sites are now inadequate and they cannot be used for the low-income RHNA, or frankly, the RHNA. And so, unless three conditions apply: one, that we zone the sites at the right density, that we include a certain number of affordable units, and if a project comes in at 20% affordable, it's permitted by right, and the rezoning occurs within a certain number of years. That's particularly for the low income. On slide number 11 will be if it's an underutilized site, that's where the rubber really is going to meet the road, because the state will say, and an underutilized site, I mean a site that has maybe an existing older commercial site. It may not be viable. Maybe it's an old residential site when the home's falling down. Whatever it happens to be, it has an existing use on it. In those kind of circumstances, we'll have to demonstrate whether those existing uses impede development. So maybe the owner doesn't want to sell and develop it. Maybe they want to knock down the house and put a mobile home on there. We have to be able to show that the existing uses would not constitute an impediment. And that requires looking at the city's history with converting existing uses to higher density. Certainly might be more viable in the downtown and other places. In other places, we may not have the history. We'll have to look at market demand for existing uses and look at development trends, market conditions, and other types of regulatory incentives to make it happen. But I guess suffice it to say is that if the current housing element sites are not deemed adequate under new state law, we'll be under the obligation to try to find some additional sites, including high density, to address the RHNA. So I don't mean to spell doom and gloom, but we do have a challenge in front of us that I think all cities are going to have, and we're up to it. But there could be some significant decision points that come about further into the process. So just in conclusion, I just wanted to give you a few things to think about and remember. Is first of all that the city does have a minimum goal of facilitating the production of 2,859 additional housing units by 2029 at a variety of housing income levels, not just low income, not just moderate, but also including above moderate income as well. And that's actually the highest portion. And that the city will be responsible for zoning the land, having the right density, and having the development standards in place to encourage that construction. Secondly, per SB 166, the no net loss, Yucaipa, the city is going to be under the obligation to ensure that there's no net loss in housing capacity for the RHNA, for the unmet RHNA at all times. Third, for SB 330, cities are generally prohibited from taking actions that reduce capacity until 2025 unless those actions are very carefully worded, i.e., we get the city attorney involved. There are a couple ways that you can do this, and I think we can explore others. I know there's been some discussions of TDR, transfer development rights. That could be a viable and possible solution to work under the right circumstances in the right locations. And the same thing with cluster development. It's also an option to intensify one area, reducing a density in another. And there's some other mechanisms as well. But if I could just leave you with these conclusions, hopefully that will give you a sense of the landscape of where we need to go and how housing and the AVA are ultimately tied very closely together. So with that, next steps. Ben, did you want to take the next steps, or did you want to have some discussion?
So we some discussion. We're gonna people.
I'm going to mute everybody.
Can they raise hands like you talked about before?
Is this hello? All right, no feedback anymore. We'll kind of do if some of the committee members want to have a little bit of discussion. Really, no action is at this point. Really, we're just trying to give some of the lay of the land, as it were, related to housing policy, recognizing that most of the vacant land within the city does have a residential land use designation associated with it, and so everyone can kind of think strategically. For the next meeting of ideas of solutions and approaches, but really just setting aside just kind of those legal parameters that we as a jurisdiction and all other cities in the state of California are subject to.
Let's try some questions and answers.
But we can try some questions and answers and see how it works, and certainly gives us some feedback for the next meeting and how to work the format as well.
Okay, Ben, this is Denise Work. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So as I see it, our challenge, just to clarify kind of what he was saying, he said a lot of things, but our challenge will be in downzoning of areas for viticultural use, and in so doing, we would have to upsize other parcels. So, but my guess is that we probably have not designated most of the vacant land in the North Bench area to a higher density that would be needed for the affordable housing and arena. Is that correct?
So the 1 acre lots, that is correct, would not be sites that would qualify for consideration as the affordable housing sites. Those would be really, right now, kind of with the no net loss stuff, would be above moderate housing, and then would be with no net loss considering other above moderate housing in place with that current destination.
So we really just need to take that into consideration as a whole when we're looking at the whole city, but most likely what we do with the viticulture is not really going to affect the arena, right?
Well, remember, the arena also includes the above moderate units, and that's over 1,000 units. So that could be a smaller lot size than 1 acre, and still have some yields in the North Bench. But you could still have certainly above moderate housing at smaller lot sizes than 1 acre.
If I could chime in on that as well. I mean, when you're contemplating, an AVA area, obviously it could potentially be taking housing sites out for the long term, and we'll have to complete the housing element by October of 2021. There's still an appeal period, and so we could see the units significantly increase. I've been seeing jurisdictions and their numbers going up and down, up to 400% up and down. And so we don't know exactly where that's going to lead, but that's to be determined. I think the other thing just to think about as well is that in some ways, once you take the land out of production per se, or for residential, is thinking about what will happen in the next 6 or 7 years. We'll have another 2,500, 4,000, who knows? It continues to be a rolling mandate. So part of it, we have a short-term issue on how we deal with this arena, but we also have longer-term issues for how do we set ourselves up or maintain that capacity for for the long term. So just to add a little bit more wrinkle to it.
Well, is the state these mandates? I mean, they're taking into consideration how much vacant land each city has, aren't they?
Honestly,
I mean, what's our ability to fulfill that if we don't have the property?
Well, it's a complicated question, and I can tell you what's happening if for a built-out city, if you're in the Los Angeles area, and technically, according to the Attorney General, they've ruled that a city's lack of land does not necessarily relieve them of the obligation to provide housing, because sites will recycle and turn over. It's very common over time as land values increase and housing demand increases and rents and sales prices increase to see some turnover of sites. And so if I was trying to think of a housing element I did years ago in Pasadena, most of their housing was due to recycling, housing turning over and turning into apartments. I mean, certainly that is not going to happen in the near term in Yucaipa, but it is something that we just have to deal with. So the answer is we can't say that we have, state law doesn't allow jurisdiction to say I don't have enough land, I can't build anymore. There's still an obligation to provide housing, as unfair as that is, it is still out there. Although it affects really the coastal cities and the LA cities much more than the Inland Empire.
If I may add, as part of the STAG approach or all the regional agencies, is they kind of grapple with the same question: is do we want to go by where the need is or just where vacant land is? If hypothetically the approach was strictly by who has the most acres of vacant land or just land that's undeveloped or underdeveloped, our numbers and many of the other inland cities would have much higher numbers. Luckily, with this approach, STAD did put greater emphasis to where job locations are and where there's a crowding or lack of housing supply, and so it was able to push a little bit back towards some of the higher demand metropolitan areas of Orange County and LA, but it is always kind of a changing approach. But if it was strictly if the approach for how the RENA is allocated is strictly by who has underdeveloped land, our expectations and surrounding cities would be a lot higher as well, and isn't necessarily the most pragmatic approach, but no, it isn't strictly, they're not looking at just acreage of land to making that number, but a number of other factors that went into that.
Okay. Okay, does anyone else have questions or
I just have
comments?
This is Tony. I have a question. Is there any relationship to, let's say, the unincorporated areas that if the city could annex that or something, pull in to get more acreage that they could then use that for housing?
That's a great question, Tony. The county has its own obligations outside of the cities. We do have one annexation area that on the 38 near Bryant, the intersection of Bryant and the 38, that has some housing. We did attempt to annex that in a few years ago. At that time, we weren't hearing about the housing crisis as much as we are now. Our efforts were to annex that in with a small percentage of the acreage being commercial and most of it being open space. But right now, that general plan designation in the county is for residential.
I think too, one of the beautiful things with the city of Yucaipa is our backdrop is the Crafton Hills area and then the National Forest. And so there isn't a lot of future residential sites that if we did go through a sphere of influence to annex, that would probably be conducive to it. And then Calamasa at the county line. So there isn't, we're kind of in our bathtub or fishbowl of with the natural terrain around it that may preclude other viable housing sites to occur beyond our borders too.
That's pretty much the only site that's in our.
Would anything on the other side of the 10 freeway, like Santa Mateo Canyon, that direction out that way? Because that's a lot of open land and.
Yeah, that's not in the city sphere of influence. It's either in Redlands or just pure Riverside County.
Okay.
That wouldn't.
The county issues, then okay.
Yeah.
But that area also does incorporate, to the extent it is in the city limits, the freeway corridor specific plan, which does include housing sites as well.
Yeah.
If I could jump in there real quick.
Yeah.
Mark, it's Christine Moeller. I want to say, being on the General Plan Advisory Committee, the housing element was one of the most intense and difficult, really, to understand and realize how shackled the cities and, all these requirements with the housing elements and financials. And one thing that we were focused on is, potentially, we agreed that the senior housing, the high-dense senior housing, affordable housing was probably the way that Yucaipa would want to go versus, a low-income housing for single families. And, one thing that we were, all of us pretty much agreed on was that there are some less desirable mobile home parks that could potentially get cleaned up and maybe, become more high dense, and we can, change those areas into a higher dense, lower income, and, channel it into more of the senior housing and, try to address the low income and low, high density in those areas and keep those away from the, less dense areas. So, the viticulture area, the cluster housing and the other open land, that's how Temecula's dealing with it, and other areas are dealing with their housing element. But the high density, as far as the affordable housing and the low income housing, I think that, that needs to particularly stay away from this area. If there's, 1,000, 1,100 units that need to go into, the higher end housing and the moderate housing, then, I think that we have to be sensitive about trying to keep the land as open as possible. And then, where the AVA, the area that we're particularly talking about, has a lot of open land in it. So, the Five Winds Ranch and the El Dorado, all that area is a lot of open space and in areas that we can't touch. There's a lot of mitigation land in there as well. So, my vision is not to have any low income or moderate, very low income in the viticulture area at all.
Hey, Ray, this is Denise.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just turned my camera on too, so you can see if I open it up here. I think that it might help if people could see how much housing we're required and what we currently have zoned, because we're required to have that entry-level housing or workforce housing already zoned. So we are already meeting those RHNA numbers in terms of our zoning. And I think that that would help people to understand, what the housing needs are and how we currently are zoning to meet those requirements as per the state numbers. And then with a focus on what we want to do with the viticultural area, it really would then kind of help the members to think about the blend of housing that best fits with a viticultural area. Where would the housing go? Where would the vineyards go? That kind of thing. So, we already have a lot of housing zoned right now, and that might help people understand what we need to do in the viticultural area.
I'll take a run if that's okay. In response, can we get
we're gonna mute one more time. All right, go ahead, Ray.
In response to your question, thank you. We do have adequate sites throughout the community, mostly in the Freeway Corridor Specific Plan, but also on Oakland Road, to meet our current housing element requirements in this current period. Those are zoned basically 24 to the acre, and they're by right locations pursuant to the existing housing element. But Mark mentioned a few minutes ago is that those locations are somewhat at risk if we can't demonstrate why they haven't developed. None of those sites have developed in this current housing cycle. And so we have to prove why they haven't developed and what we are going to do or have done to overcome the impediments for why they haven't developed in order for them to count as part of our requirements for this next coming housing cycle. And so that 2,800 number is the new number, but some of those housing sites may or may not count as we move forward with the new housing element process. In addition, we do have higher density sites, of course, in the Uptown Specific Plan. And some of us have talked, I think, about the possibility of expanding those locations, that specific plan boundary, or the densities perhaps in the Uptown as well. So those are some of the options relative to, as you mentioned, the workforce development housing versus the moderate and above moderate housing. I think everybody agrees that the moderate and above moderate housing could fit in well with the AVA implementation area. And I'm going to get ahead of ourselves here, but I'll just throw this out there for consideration. You could have a ring of vineyards and boutique wineries, which is, I think, is what I've been hearing anyway from most of the committee members along Oakland Road, along perhaps even Jefferson back to Carter. With some of the housing, as Mark talked about earlier, clustered up over the ridge, if you will. And so along Oakland Road, your vision, your aesthetic would be the vineyards and wineries. Along Jefferson, at least for part of it, the same thing. So there are ways, I think, somebody mentioned a few meetings ago, to balance the housing in the vineyard wineries and in the North Bench area, maybe even the Freeway Corridor area up in the hills, and still have that aesthetic along the main streets, and still help to meet our moderate and above moderate income housing requirements. Because as I understand it, HED is going to be looking at all of these income ranges and the delivery of housing in all these income ranges, even though we're not delivering housing. They're going to be really looking at those reports every year to see how we're doing.
Yeah, I think now cities, and I know Ben, you've had to submit the annual progress report, and HED has been laying on the requirements to show affordability levels, and using that as kind of a way to check in on cities and the progress in terms of actually having these units constructed at all income levels. And so I do expect, if I had to predict, that they'll use that as more of an enforcement tool. But that's just me reading the tea leaves and looking forward. But I do think, what we are seeing essentially is a greater involvement in the state in housing, and also a greater involvement with the Attorney General's office as well. So it's just part of the landscape that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I would agree that the reporting requirements from the state has increased a lot in the past few years of what they're looking for, and they're really seeing what projects are being submitted, what action cities are taking, whether or not they're approving the projects as they're kind of proposed, if cities are approving projects with less units or denying them, and trying to piece together kind of what the decision-making process is. I did want to kind of back up a second. We talked about kind of the affordable housing. Really, the affordable housing sites probably won't have too much of a bearing a lot with some of the AVA potential areas. There's certainly in the Freeway Corridor Specific Plan a number of affordable housing sites, but if we're considering other vacant land in the north end, the no net loss wouldn't necessarily apply specifically to the lower income ranges, but just keeping in mind as the residential designations exist on some of those other properties, the no net loss provision is still kicking. So we'll have to figure out collectively what we do with that land to ensure that there's sufficient acreage available for the AVA idea to really grow and blossom and to foster that environment and make sure that there isn't a competing priorities for the development patterns for what a winery would need versus other types of development, and going from there.
You're still muted.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything to discuss or questions?
General House,
None?
if you are trying to make a comment, make sure your mic is unmuted.
Okay, then Sheila can help us with kind of the next. I will kind of note as the meetings or as we respond to the COVID-19 issues and how that impacts the ability to have meetings. Our agenda may fluctuate a little bit, but hopefully we want to keep making progress and getting the vision forward and keeping that. And so hopefully as the next meetings occur and we get a little bit more comfortable with the meeting formats, have a little bit more collaboration discussion for the projects, and start making some of our goals and objectives, ideas more solidified. But this is really kind of the wrap up of some of the background information going on. And so, Sheila, if you want to take the lead on kind of the two final PowerPoint slides, and we'll go from there.
Sheila, are you muted?
She is. Star six, or
Actually, Sheila, if you there's an icon at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse.
And then do you want to put the PowerPoint slide back on? Because she'll use that as the discussion point.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
There we go.
That we can.
PowerPoint.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, great. I can pull up the PowerPoint now.
So we went one too far. We're one too far on those slides.
Sorry about that. There you go.
Okay. All right. So our next meeting will be around May 19th, and we're going to go over we're going to hear from the Yucaipa Wine Alliance on the status of the AVA application process. And they're going to share with us a broad overview of all the research they conducted during the application process. And then we're going to cover some of the technical needs of AVA elements, things like the ultimate parcel size for the type of boutique wineries that we're looking for in Yucaipa, what the needs of tasting rooms are. We're going to be discussing the needs of special events and the ramifications of things like weddings or special occasion, large events or small events. And then also the Wine Alliance has quite a few technical resources available for committee members. So those will be helpful if all of you want to do individual research so that you can ask questions and become a little bit more knowledgeable about exactly what the technical needs of wineries are.
I think
are there any questions about that?
Just to add in, I think we would like to, given how intensive kind of the AVA process is, the Wine Alliance has done a lot to submit the petition for that designation through the federal government and that review. And so we really want to give a snapshot, I think, for all the other committee members that aren't affiliated with the Wine Alliance, a better idea and appreciation of that level of effort. And so that can help give a greater foundation of kind of this project. And we're at the city helping kind of facilitate the land use side, but want to recognize that endeavor as well for the federal government review of establishing an AVA in an area. So.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yes,
No,
I have.
I don't have any.
Denise,
Go
I
ahead.
have one. At our last meeting, and I spoke with Ben about this briefly today, but at our last meeting, I thought we were supposed to send Sheila our visions that we can all share with everybody. Is that our next, after the May meeting, or are we supposed to do that still? Or I just want to make sure I'm doing everything that we're supposed to be doing. Because it was the visions and the goals and objectives, I think, that we were talking about.
Yeah, I was going to ask that same question. I know I think we've touched on it a bit, but I'd like to make sure that we have it. Maybe we send it to her to kind of incorporate, here's our thoughts. How does that go together? Because I think that might help clarify by answering some of the questions right at that point in time.
I think everybody needs to see everybody's vision. You know what I mean? Because we all represent different committees and different interests. And I think I think it's valuable if we all know what our all visions are. I mean, I'm sure it's very similar, but I think it'd just be good to see everybody's vision, be able to share that anyways.
Oh, I was just wondering if we could go to the next slide, please.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was just going to say this is okay. All right. Trying to get together, kind of all of us to agree on goals and objectives at some point, because we, number one, have to understand what the city is dealing with, and the housing element and all those things that have to be taken into consideration. So I think that's important, and it sounds like Sheila will be doing in this, correct?
Actually, the visioning meeting will be the June meeting. The May meeting will be, we'll be revisiting housing during that meeting. The May meeting is more the technical aspects of the requirements for viticulture.
Okay, great. A little bit of more time, Christine, for all of us to be able to take the information. And actually, the next meeting, that information is important as well, because we'll have a better idea of how many acres of grapes and how many, wineries and all that sort of thing that that we can actually sustain and with the area that's available.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Okay, did you have more to say, Sheila?
Oh, I was just going to say, Denise, that was a really good summary, because the next meeting will round out our fact-finding portion of the committee's investigations. So once we have a really good overview of all the facts, then we're going to launch into more of the visioning process.
Ben or Christine, are you going to forward to us the slide presentation that we saw today?
Yes, we can forward that, similar to the last meeting, so that will be provided for everyone for their reference on this kind of thing. We'll continue providing those resources from each meeting as well, so that everyone has known what we talked about and can certainly mull it over kind of afterwards and think about ideas that they have. And yeah, we certainly want to keep the thought process going after the meeting, so that we come back and have a good jumping off point for the next one.
Yeah, a lot of those housing numbers, I think, would be important to review and look at the various areas in the city. So.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping that the next meeting we won't have to do it this way. So.
Here.
Yep.
Hopefully.
Keep it a little light with the heavy dialogue at this one as kind of the test run, because certainly with in a computerized setting where we can't really be in the same room together and see everyone's responses and when someone wants to talk, see that engagement occur. It does make it a little bit more challenging, but I again want to express my appreciation for everyone that's attending and keeping this kind of project moving forward. Certainly there's a lot going on in the world, but when the dust settles, there'll still be a city here that we want to make sure that the future is bright and sunny, and so keep the progression going afterwards and get some good progress in.
Well put.